The morning of November 8, 1943, a Japanese convoy steams through the Philippine Sea. 14 cargo ships arranged in 2 neat columns, flanked by 4 destroyer escorts. The night is moonless, the visibility near zero. The convoy commander, a veteran of 2 years of Pacific warfare, believes his ships are safe. Submarines, after all, hunt by periscope during daylight. At night, submerged and blind, they're helpless. Surface visibility in this weather extends perhaps 2,000 yards on a clear night, maybe less in this rain. The convoy maintains radio silence, changes course every 20 minutes, according to doctrine, and runs without lights. Every precaution has been taken, every rule followed. Yet 20 miles away, USS Pargo already knows exactly where they are. Not from visual sighting, not from periscope observation, but from a rotating antenna mounted on her bridge, sending invisible pulses into the darkness and receiving back precise echoes of distance, bearing, and speed. The Japanese don't know this technology exists on submarines. When their ships begin exploding at midnight, they'll assume it was luck. Terrible, impossible luck. By dawn, 6 of those 14 cargo ships will be on the bottom, and the surviving convoy commander will file a report describing an attack that, by every principle of submarine warfare he understands, should have been impossible. This weapon, this revolutionary technology that the Japanese Navy never detected on American submarines, would sink approximately 1,200 Japanese ships over 3 years of warfare. It would transform night from a sanctuary into a killing field, and it would do something even more psychologically devastating. It would make Japanese naval officers question reality itself, because the attacks they were experiencing violated every tactical assumption, every training principle, every understood limitation of submarine warfare. How do you defend against an enemy who can see you when you cannot see them? How do you evade detection when the detection method is completely unknown to you? If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The roots of this technological revolution reach back to 1941, when the United States Navy recognized a fundamental problem with submarine warfare. Submarines were designed to be invisible, but that invisibility came with a crippling limitation. A submerged submarine was effectively blind. Periscopes provided limited daytime vision, perhaps 5 to 7 miles in perfect conditions, far less at night or in weather. Sonar could detect ships, but only at close range, and with significant uncertainty about bearing and distance. This meant that finding enemy ships required either incredible luck, precise intelligence about convoy routes, or dangerous surface operations where the submarine was exposed and vulnerable. Pre-war doctrine emphasized patient, defensive operations. Submarines would patrol likely shipping lanes, wait for targets to appear within periscope range, and attack from submerged positions. This was safe, stealthy, and almost completely ineffective against a skilled enemy who zigzagged, changed course frequently, and traveled in convoys with destroyer escorts. The solution began with an improbable technology: radar. The use of radio waves to detect distant objects, by sending pulses of electromagnetic energy and measuring the echoes that bounced back. British and American researchers had developed radar for aircraft detection in the late 1930s, creating systems that could spot incoming bombers at ranges of 50 to 100 miles. By 1940, shipboard radar was being installed on cruisers and destroyers, giving surface fleets the ability to detect enemy vessels beyond visual range. But submarines presented unique challenges. Radar equipment in 1941 was large, heavy, and power-hungry. It required substantial antennas, complex electronics, and trained operators. Submarines had limited space, limited power generation, and crews already stretched thin operating the boat's systems. Early submarine radar, designated SD, was primitive. Installed on American submarines beginning in 1941, it could detect aircraft at roughly 6 to 10 miles, giving submarines warning to dive before being spotted. But SD radar was almost useless for surface search. It lacked directional capability, couldn't provide accurate bearings, and had insufficient range to be tactically useful for finding enemy ships. This changed in mid-1942. Naval Research Laboratories, working with MIT's Radiation Laboratory, developed a revolutionary new radar system specifically designed for submarine operations. It was designated SJ radar, and it would transform submarine warfare as profoundly as the torpedo itself. SJ radar operated at 10 centimeters wavelength, what's called S-band frequency. This was significantly higher frequency than earlier radars, which meant smaller antennas, better resolution, and more accurate target information. The entire system was compact enough to fit through submarine hatches for installation, crucial because submarines couldn't be extensively modified without dry dock time the Navy couldn't afford to spare. The radar antenna mounted on a retractable mast that could be raised while surfaced, rotating to scan 360 degrees of horizon. In the submarine's conning tower, an operator watched a plan position indicator, or PPI scope, a circular display where radar contacts appeared as bright blips. The operator could measure bearing and distance with remarkable precision. A large ship might be detected at 20 miles or more, a destroyer at 15 miles. Even a small patrol boat could be picked up at 10 miles in good conditions. Ranges that were utterly impossible with visual observation at night. More importantly, SJ radar was directional. The submarine commander knew not just that a ship was out there, but exactly where it was, how fast it was moving, and in which direction. This transformed submarine tactics from educated guesses into calculated science. By early 1943, SJ radar was being installed on virtually every fleet submarine in the Pacific. The technology itself was classified at the highest levels. Submarine commanders were briefed extensively on radar capabilities, but also on security. They were never to mention radar in radio communications unless using specific codes. If attacked or forced to abandon ship, radar equipment was to be destroyed immediately. The Japanese were not to discover this capability, and for an astonishingly long time, they didn't. The Imperial Japanese Navy had its own radar development program. Japanese scientists had been experimenting with radio detection since the mid-1930s. By 1942, Japan had deployed some early warning radar systems for air defense, particularly around major bases and the home islands. But Japanese radar development faced severe institutional obstacles. The Army and Navy refused to cooperate, each developing separate systems that often duplicated efforts and never shared advances. Japanese universities lacked the academic freedom that fostered innovation in American and British research programs. Technical personnel were difficult to recruit. One German professor visiting Japan in 1938 observed that Japanese universities resembled senior high schools, with predetermined curricula that stifled creative research. Perhaps most critically, Japanese naval leadership did not prioritize radar for surface vessels. The doctrine that had served them so well in the first year of the war, the emphasis on night combat, torpedo attacks, and superior optics, seemed to be working. Why invest heavily in unproven electronics when Japanese lookouts, trained in exceptional night vision and equipped with excellent binoculars, could spot enemy ships at night far better than any technology? By 1943, some Japanese warships carried radar, primitive air search sets that could detect high-flying aircraft. But these systems were unreliable, poorly understood by crews, and often kept shut down to avoid providing Allied direction-finding equipment with a signal to home on. Japanese doctrine actually required radar silence until enemy aircraft were within 10 miles, which eliminated radar's primary advantage of early warning. Surface search radar, the type that could detect ships at sea, was virtually non-existent in the Imperial Japanese Navy until late 1944. Even then, only a handful of warships received the equipment, and Japanese destroyers, the vessels that might escort convoys, almost never had it. More significantly, Japanese submarines, the vessels that might have warned of American submarine capabilities through captured equipment or survivor interviews, never received submarine-mounted surface search radar at all. This created an intelligence blind spot of staggering proportions. The Japanese Navy, fighting a desperate war against American submarines that were systematically destroying their merchant marine, never understood that every single one of those submarines could see in the dark. The asymmetry was profound. An American submarine commander, surfaced at night, could detect a Japanese convoy at ranges of 15 to 20 miles, sometimes more. He could track multiple ships simultaneously, plot their courses, calculate their speeds, and maneuver into optimal attack position, all while the convoy remained completely unaware of his presence. Then, having positioned his submarine with mathematical precision, he could charge into the convoy at high speed, surface torpedoes at point-blank range from multiple targets, and escape in the confusion while Japanese escorts searched blindly for an enemy they couldn't see and couldn't imagine existed. From the Japanese perspective, these attacks were incomprehensible. Submarine attacks were supposed to come during the day, from periscope depth, with torpedoes that gave some warning of approach. Night attacks were considered nearly impossible, a desperate gamble where the submarine had no more visibility than the target. Yet these attacks were happening with disturbing frequency and devastating accuracy. Ships were being sunk in the darkest hours of night, in weather conditions where visual detection should have been impossible, with a precision that suggested the submarines knew exactly where every ship in the convoy was located. Japanese naval intelligence speculated wildly. Perhaps American submarines had superior optics, some kind of advanced night vision capability. Perhaps they were using sound detection, listening for the noise of ship propellers through hydrophones, and attacking based on audio cues. Perhaps, some theorists suggested, the Americans had developed a form of magnetic detection that could sense the presence of steel hulls at distance. None of these theories came close to the truth. The reality was simpler and more devastating. The Americans could see them, and they couldn't see back. Consider the tactical revolution this created. Before radar, submarine warfare was largely opportunistic. A submarine would patrol a likely shipping route and hope that a target appeared within detection range. If the submarine was surfaced, this might mean visual range of perhaps 10 miles in daylight, far less at night. If submerged, it meant periscope range of 5 to 7 miles at best. Attack opportunities were rare, and many required hours of maneuvering to achieve a firing position. With SJ radar, everything changed. A submarine could detect convoys at ranges of 20 miles or more, often before the convoy's lookouts could possibly spot the submarine. This gave the submarine commander enormous tactical flexibility. He could track the convoy's course and speed while remaining undetected, plot an intercept course, and position his submarine ahead of the convoy's path. Then, as the convoy approached, he could surface, use radar to confirm positions, and attack from optimal angles. The entire process was calculable, predictable, almost scientific in its precision. More importantly, radar enabled night surface attacks to become standard tactics rather than desperate gambles. Before radar, a submarine commander attacking at night was essentially blind, relying on brief glimpses of ship silhouettes against a slightly lighter sky, guessing at ranges and bearings. With radar, that same commander had precise, continuous tracking of every ship in the convoy. He knew where the escorts were. He knew where the cargo ships were. He knew which ships were large, valuable targets and which were smaller auxiliaries. He could select his targets methodically, fire his torpedoes with confidence, and evade with precision. The American submarine force, which had struggled through 18 months of near-total ineffectiveness due to defective torpedoes, suddenly became the most lethal naval weapon in the Pacific theater. And the Japanese never understood why. Submarine commanders began developing attack techniques that exploited radar's capabilities. One particularly effective method was the end-around. A submarine would detect a convoy at long range, then run on the surface at high speed, using its 16 to 18 knot surface speed to race ahead of the convoy and position itself in front of the convoy's path. Once in position, the submarine would wait, submerge to periscope depth as the convoy approached, or remain surfaced if confidence in position was high, then attack as the convoy arrived. Radar made this possible by providing continuous tracking of the convoy's position, course, and speed, even when the protector submarine was running at high speed and could not use the periscope. Another technique was the coordinated attack. Multiple submarines operating in the same area would share radar contact information, vectoring each other towards the convoy. While one submarine might distract escorts or be detected, the others, using radar to track the chaos, would slip in undetected and deliver devastating attacks. These Wolfpack tactics, borrowed from German U-boat operations in the Atlantic, but perfected with radar in the Pacific, created situations where Japanese convoys might face simultaneous attacks from multiple directions, coordinated with a precision that seemed almost supernatural to the defenders. The psychological impact on Japanese merchant marine crews and naval officers was severe. Ship captains began to report attacks that violated every known principle of submarine warfare. Convoys were being ambushed in the darkest nights, in the worst weather, with an accuracy that seemed to indicate the submarines had exact advance knowledge of routes and schedules. Some officers theorized that American submarines must be receiving intelligence from spies in Japanese ports, detailed information about departure times and routing. This was partially true. American code-breaking provided excellent intelligence about convoy schedules. But code-breaking couldn't explain how submarines found convoys in the vast Pacific Ocean, or how they maneuvered with such precision in total darkness. The truth was simpler and more terrifying. The submarines didn't need spies in ports because they had radar at sea. By mid-1943, the cumulative effect of radar-equipped submarines became impossible to ignore. Japanese shipping losses, which had been substantial throughout 1942 and early 1943, suddenly exploded. In 1942, American submarines had sunk approximately 500,000 tons of Japanese shipping. In 1943, with working torpedoes and effective radar, that number jumped to nearly 1.8 million tons. But it was in 1944 that the true devastation became apparent. With torpedo problems fully resolved, radar systems refined through operational experience, and aggressive new tactics fully implemented, American submarines achieved what can only be described as systematic annihilation of the Japanese merchant marine. In about 520 war patrols during 1944, American submarines sank over 600 Japanese merchant ships, totaling approximately 2.7 million tons, more ships than in the first 25 months of war combined. Japanese commodity imports, the lifeblood of the island empire, plunged from 16.4 million tons to 10 million tons in a single year. The submarines were strangling Japan's economy, and radar was the invisible hand tightening the noose. Consider what these numbers meant in human terms. 600. Merchant ships represented thousands of skilled merchant marine officers and crew members, men with families, men who had trained for years in their profession, men whose experience could not be replaced. Every ship sunk was also a catastrophic loss of cargo: oil tankers carrying fuel for Japanese aircraft, freighters loaded with raw materials for war production, transports packed with troops being shifted between garrison islands, rice ships bringing food to feed the population. Every single one of these vessels was critical to Japan's ability to continue fighting, and every single one that went to the bottom made the empire weaker, more desperate, more vulnerable. The Japanese tried to respond. Convoy escort procedures were tightened. Destroyers were assigned to protect merchant ships, though never in sufficient numbers. Routing was changed more frequently. Ships began to hug coastlines where shallow water might protect them from submarine attack, though this made them vulnerable to mines and aircraft. But none of these measures addressed the fundamental problem. The Japanese couldn't defend against an advantage they didn't know existed. If Japanese naval intelligence had understood that American submarines carried sophisticated radar, countermeasures might have been possible. Japanese warships could have been equipped with radar detectors that would warn of submarine radar emissions. Convoys could have been routed to avoid areas where radar was most effective. Escorts could have used their own primitive radar to search for surfaced submarines. But because Japanese intelligence never discovered or understood the scope of American submarine radar capabilities, none of these countermeasures were developed. The submarines continued their slaughter undetected, unhindered, and almost unopposed. There's a bitter irony in how the secret was maintained. American submarines were occasionally sunk, about 52 boats over the course of the war. A casualty rate of 22% that made submarine duty the most dangerous service in the American military. When these submarines were lost, any radar equipment aboard sank with them. Japanese forces occasionally captured submarine crew members, survivors of sunk boats who became prisoners of war. These men were interrogated extensively, questioned about tactics, training, and equipment. But submarine crews had been thoroughly briefed on security. They knew that revealing radar capabilities would endanger other submarines. Some simply refused to discuss technical matters. Others provided misleading information, describing primitive SD air search radar, but never mentioning the far more capable SJ surface search system. Japanese interrogators, lacking the technical background to ask the right questions, never penetrated this security. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The transformation in American submarine effectiveness between 1942 and 1944 represents one of the most dramatic combat turnarounds in naval history. It resulted from fixing the catastrophic torpedo problems that had plagued the first 18 months of war, problems where torpedoes ran too deep, exploded prematurely, or failed to explode at all. It resulted from aggressive new tactics pioneered by commanders like Dudley Morton, who proved that submarines could successfully attack on the surface at night. And it resulted from radar, the technological advantage that made aggressive tactics possible by giving submarines the ability to see when their enemies were blind. The strategic consequences rippled across the Pacific War. By late 1944, Japan's merchant marine was approaching total collapse. Ships that had survived 2, 3, or 4 years of war were finally being sunk. Experienced crews were dead or scattered across so many undermanned ships that efficiency plummeted. New construction, never sufficient to replace losses, was further hampered by Allied air attacks on Japanese shipyards and by growing shortages of steel and other raw materials. The Navy, desperate to maintain supply lines, began pressing fishing boats, coastal freighters, and even small private vessels into service as cargo carriers. Many of these were under 1,000 tons, barely capable of crossing open ocean, certainly not fast enough to evade submarines or well built enough to survive torpedo hits. They sank in enormous numbers, often with total loss of crew. Japanese industry, starved for raw materials, began shutting down production lines. Aircraft factories ran short of aluminum. Steel mills lacked iron ore. Ammunition plants ran low on explosives. The synthetic fuel plants that Japan had built to reduce dependence on imported oil couldn't get the coal they needed to operate. By early 1945, Japanese industrial production had fallen to a fraction of 1941 levels, not because factories had been bombed, though some had, but because submarines had cut off the flow of materials. The Japanese military found itself unable to move forces where they were needed. Troops stationed in China, Southeast Asia, and scattered Pacific islands were effectively stranded. Moving them required ships that no longer existed or couldn't be risked in waters patrolled by submarines. Reinforcing garrison islands became almost impossible. The climactic battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa were fought with the defenders unable to receive significant reinforcements or supplies because submarines controlled the sea lanes. Even the home islands faced genuine hunger. Japan, with over 70 million people crowded onto islands that could not feed themselves, depended on rice imports from Korea, Taiwan, and Southeast Asia. As submarine warfare intensified, these shipments dwindled, then nearly stopped. By mid-1945, civilian rations in Japanese cities had fallen below subsistence levels. People were genuinely starving, not from American bombs, but from American submarines that had severed the lifelines keeping the population alive. And through all of this, the Japanese Navy never understood the fundamental reason for their shipping catastrophe. Reports from convoy commanders described impossible attacks, submarines that appeared to know exact convoy positions, attacks delivered with precision in conditions where such precision should have been impossible. Intelligence officers speculated about enhanced American training, about superior periscopes, about new kinds of torpedoes that must surely explain the devastating accuracy. None came close to the truth. The Americans had radar, and that changed everything. The question that haunted Japanese naval planning by 1945 was both simple and unanswerable. How do you defend shipping when the enemy can find your convoys with near certainty, can attack with scientific precision and then disappear before your escorts can respond. Some Japanese officers proposed abandoning convoy routes entirely, having ships sail independently and depend on luck to avoid submarines. This was tried occasionally and proved even more disastrous, as isolated ships were even more vulnerable to patient submarine commanders who could stalk them for hours before attacking. Others suggested running supplies by submarine rather than surface ships, on the theory that submarines couldn't sink what they couldn't find. Japan attempted this with some limited success, but Japanese submarines were far fewer in number than the cargo ships they were meant to replace, and their carrying capacity was minimal compared to even a small freighter. By the final months of the war, Japanese merchant shipping had been so thoroughly destroyed that the submarine campaign effectively ended, not because the submarines stopped operating, but because there were simply no more significant targets to sink. The few remaining Japanese ships huddled in port, unwilling to venture into waters they knew were patrolled by submarines they couldn't detect and couldn't fight. This is the story of an invisible weapon. Not invisible because it was secret, though its specific capabilities were highly classified. Invisible because the enemy never detected its presence, never understood how it worked, never developed countermeasures, and never even knew it was the primary reason their shipping was being destroyed. The Japanese Navy fought World War II in the Pacific against submarines that could see them clearly while remaining themselves unseen. It was warfare as asymmetric as cavalry against machine guns, battleships against aircraft carriers, warriors with swords against warriors with rifles. The side with the technological advantage won because their advantage was so complete, so overwhelming, that the other side couldn't even comprehend what they were facing. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, American submarines had sunk approximately 1,200 Japanese merchant ships and 200 warships. They had destroyed more than half of Japan's merchant marine tonnage. They had killed tens of thousands of merchant marine crew members, soldiers being transported between garrisons, and sailors serving on warships. And they had done this while operating as a tiny percentage of American naval forces, 52 boats, and 16,000 men at sea, constituting less than 2% of the Navy, but achieving more than 50% of Japanese shipping destruction. The legacy of submarine radar extends far beyond World War II statistics. Modern submarines, whether diesel-electric boats patrolling coastal waters or nuclear-powered monsters prowling deep ocean, depend on sensors that trace their lineage directly to SJ radar. The principle remains unchanged. Detect the enemy before they detect you, maneuver with precision while they maneuver blindly, and strike with calculated accuracy while they fight shadows. Electronic warfare, the science of detecting, jamming, and exploiting enemy sensors, has its roots in the radar campaigns of World War II. Today's naval forces invest billions in stealth technologies designed to minimize radar signatures, in electronic countermeasures designed to confuse enemy radars, and in increasingly sophisticated sensors designed to penetrate enemy stealth and countermeasures. This technological arms race began in the Pacific when American submarines used radar to find Japanese ships that had no idea they were being electronically tracked. But perhaps the most important legacy is strategic. The American submarine campaign demonstrated that economic warfare, systematically destroying an enemy's ability to sustain military operations, can be as decisive as destroying their military forces directly. Japan lost World War II not primarily because its army and navy were defeated, in battle, though they certainly were, but because its economy was strangled by submarines that cut the arteries feeding the empire. Modern strategic thinking about blockades, about interdiction campaigns, about targeting logistics rather than combat forces, all derive from lessons learned in the Pacific Submarine War. Military planners understand that in modern warfare, destroying an enemy's supply chain can be more effective than destroying their frontline units. Cut off fuel, ammunition, food, and replacement parts, and even the finest military forces become ineffective. This principle, proven by radar-equipped submarines hunting Japanese merchant ships in dark Pacific waters, remains central to military doctrine worldwide. There's a human dimension to this story that statistics and tactical analysis can obscure. Consider the experience of an American submarine crew on a typical war patrol in 1944. 70 to 80 men, living in a steel tube, roughly 300 feet long and 27 feet wide at its widest point. They would depart from Pearl Harbor, Fremantle, or another forward base and steam for weeks toward their assigned patrol area, often waters near Japan, the Philippines, or the South China Sea, deep in enemy-controlled territory. The living conditions were barely tolerable. The interior of a submarine at sea could reach temperatures above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The air grew progressively more foul as carbon dioxide built up and oxygen was consumed. Men slept in bunks, stacked 3 high with barely 18 inches between them. Some slept on cots strung between torpedoes. Privacy was non-existent. The entire crew shared perhaps 2 or 3 toilets, and even those sometimes couldn't be flushed when the submarine was deep or under attack. Food was monotonous. Fresh provisions lasted perhaps a week, after which meals consisted of canned goods and dried stores that became increasingly unappetizing as the weeks passed. Water was strictly rationed. Showers, when allowed at all, might be limited to 30 seconds of water to wet down, then 30 seconds to rinse off. Some submarines went weeks without anyone being able to shower properly. The smell inside the boat, a mixture of diesel fuel, unwashed bodies, cooking odors, and the tang of battery acid, became so pervasive that crew members stopped noticing it, though they could smell it on themselves for days after returning to port. And every moment of every day, they lived with the knowledge that their survival depended on remaining undetected. A single mistake, one careless noise, one moment of bad luck, and destroyers would be overhead dropping depth charges. The experience of being depth charged was terrifying beyond description. The submarine would crash dive, racing to get below the thermocline layer where sonar had difficulty tracking, then rigging for silent running. Every unnecessary piece of equipment would be shut off. Men would stop moving. Conversations ceased. The only sounds would be the creaking of the hull under pressure and the distant propellers of destroyers hunting above. Then the depth charges would begin. Each explosion created a hammer blow that shook the entire boat. Light bulbs would shatter, gauges would crack. Cork insulation would rain down from the overhead. Depth charges set to explode at the submarine's depth would create pressure waves that compressed the hull, forcing it to groan and pop as metal flexed beyond design tolerances. Men would stand frozen, listening to their boat being tortured, wondering if the next explosion would be the one that cracked the pressure hull and sent tons of seawater flooding in at lethal pressure. Some depth charge attacks lasted hours. The submarine, unable to surface, unable to run, unable to fight back, could only sit silently and endure while destroyers above methodically worked a search pattern, dropping charges in an attempt to bracket the submarine and deliver a pars, killing blow. Battery power would dwindle. The air would grow more toxic. Men would begin to experience splitting headaches from carbon dioxide buildup. Some would lose consciousness. And through it all, they had to remain absolutely silent, because any noise might give away their position and bring another pattern of depth charges down upon them. Yet these men, subjected to these conditions patrol after patrol, achieved extraordinary things. The casualty rate was 22%, meaning roughly 1 in 5 submariners who went to war never came home. 52 submarines were lost with all hands, boats that left port on patrol and simply never returned. In some cases, we know what happened. Depth charges that finally cracked the hull, mines that detonated beneath the boat, torpedoes from enemy submarines, aircraft attacks while surfaced. In other cases, submarines simply vanished, and we can only speculate about their fate. USS Wahoo, commanded by Dudley Mush Morton, the legendary submarine captain who had pioneered aggressive surface attacks, was lost in October 1943 in La Perouse Strait. Japanese records eventually revealed that aircraft had spotted the submarine and delivered a fatal attack. Morton, who had sunk more than 20 Japanese ships in less than a year of command, never knew that his boat had been detected. The entire crew, 80 men, died with him. USS Tang, commanded by Richard O'Kane, Morton's former executive officer and perhaps the most successful submarine commander of the war, was lost in October 1944 under circumstances that might be the cruelest irony in submarine warfare history. After sinking 13 ships on its 5th war patrol, a record-setting performance, Tang fired its last torpedo at a Japanese transport. The torpedo malfunctioned, circled back, and struck Tang. The submarine sank in less than a minute. 9 men, including O'Kane, survived and were captured. The rest of the crew, 78 men, went down with the boat. USS Grunion was lost in July 1942 off the coast of Alaska, with all 70 crew members. The submarine wasn't found until 2006, when wreckage was located showing that Grunion had been sunk by return fire from a Japanese patrol boat it was attacking. The submarine had been missing for 64 years before families finally learned what had happened. These losses, and the dozens of others like them, represented not just strategic setbacks, but profound human tragedies. Every submarine carried 70 to 80 men who had families, who had lives before the war, who had dreams for after the war. Every boat lost meant 70 to 80 families who received telegrams informing them that their son, husband, father, or brother was missing and presumed lost. In many cases, families never learned exactly what happened, only that the submarine failed to return from patrol. Yet, the submariners kept volunteering. After every loss, after every patrol that came back with stories of depth, charge attacks, and near misses, men continued to sign up for submarine duty. Some were motivated by patriotism, the genuine belief that they were fighting to win the war and save lives by shortening the conflict. Others were drawn by the extra pay that submarine duty offered, money that could support families or build savings for after the war. Some simply found that they were good at this particular form of warfare, that they had the temperament to remain calm under pressure, to endure weeks of boredom punctuated by moments of terror, to function effectively in an environment that drove many men to psychological breakdown. And they were effective. The submariners of World War II, comprising less than 2% of the Navy's personnel, accounted for more than 55% of Japanese shipping losses. They sank 8 aircraft carriers, 1 battleship, 11 cruisers, and over 200 other warships. Destroyed Japan's ability to wage war more effectively than the strategic bombing campaign, more effectively than the island-hopping campaign, more effectively than any other single American military effort in the Pacific. The Japanese perspective on this campaign deserves consideration as well. For Japanese merchant marine officers, the war became a nightmare of impossible choices. Every voyage carried the risk of submarine attack. Convoys offered some protection through destroyer escorts, but convoys also moved slowly and were easier to detect than independent ships. Ships sailing alone could make better speed and theoretically be harder to find, but if detected, they had no protection at all. Japanese merchant captains developed superstitions and rituals. Some believed that certain routes were cursed, that ships traveling those routes never returned. Others believed that maintaining strict radio silence protected them, not understanding that radio emissions weren't how submarines were finding them. Some captains tried unpredictable routing, changing course randomly every few minutes, hoping that erratic movement might confuse submarine commanders. What they didn't know was that radar tracking made their movements predictable, regardless of course changes. The doctrine of aggressive counterattack, charging toward the direction of torpedo launches and dropping depth charges in the area where the submarine was thought to be, occasionally worked, but more often resulted in destroying empty ocean, while the submarine, having tracked the destroyer's approach with radar, simply moved to a different position and prepared another attack. Japanese naval intelligence struggled to understand the pattern of losses. Reports from convoy commanders were studied extensively. Charts were prepared showing where attacks occurred, what times of day they happened, what weather conditions prevailed, whether convoys or independent ships were more vulnerable. Patterns emerged, but the patterns were misleading. Attacks seemed to cluster in certain areas, leading to the conclusion that submarines must be concentrated there, when the reality was that submarines were distributed throughout Japanese-controlled waters and simply attacking whichever convoys they found. Attacks occurred overwhelmingly at night, leading to theories about American submarine doctrine favoring night operations, when the reality was that radar made night operations far more effective than daytime attacks. Large, slow-moving ships seemed disproportionately targeted, suggesting that submarines were selecting victims based on visual observation of size, when the reality was that radar returns from large ships were stronger and easier to track. Every conclusion Japanese intelligence drew was based on the false assumption that American submarines were operating with the same limitations as Japanese submarines. The possibility that American submarines had a fundamental technological advantage. 1. That allowed them to detect ships beyond visual range regardless of weather or lighting conditions, was considered but never confirmed. Japanese radar experts knew that radar could theoretically be mounted on submarines. They had themselves experimented with submarine radar for air search purposes. But the technical challenges of mounting effective surface search radar on submarines, given the equipment's size, power requirements, and the need for careful antenna installation, seemed prohibitive. Japanese intelligence estimated that if American submarines did have radar, it would be primitive air search equipment similar to what Japanese submarines carried, useful for detecting approaching aircraft, but of limited value for finding ships. The possibility that American submarines carried sophisticated surface search radar comparable to what cruisers and destroyers used never seriously entered Japanese strategic calculations. By late 1944, some Japanese signals, intelligence units had detected radar emissions in areas where submarine attacks subsequently occurred. These reports were analyzed, but the analysis was hampered by lack of understanding about radar technology and by the assumption that radar emissions must be coming from American surface ships or aircraft, not submarines. The idea that submarines might be radiating powerful radar signals while hunting in enemy-controlled waters seemed tactically absurd. Surely the radar emissions would alert Japanese forces and draw attacks. None of these countermeasures were implemented because the fundamental capability was never discovered. Japanese anti-submarine warfare continued to operate on pre-radar assumptions about submarine limitations, assuming that submarines hunted primarily by periscope or sound and were effectively blind at night. Japanese convoy tactics, routing procedures, escort doctrines, all were designed to counter an enemy that didn't exist, while the actual enemy, radar-equipped submarines operating with nearly perfect information about convoy positions, continued their methodical destruction of Japanese shipping. By August 1945, when Japan surrendered, the merchant marine that had begun the war with approximately 6 million tons of shipping had been reduced to less than 1.5 million tons still afloat. American submarines accounted for the majority of those losses. The oil didn't flow from the Dutch East Indies. The raw materials stayed in China and Southeast Asia. The food didn't reach the home islands. The troops couldn't be moved where they were needed. An empire built on conquest and maintained by sea power simply ran out of everything it needed to continue fighting. The ultimate irony is that Japan had developed some radar technology. Japanese scientists understood the principles. Japanese engineers could build radar systems. Japanese factories produced radar equipment, but institutional failures, inter-service, rivalries, cultural resistance to abandoning traditional methods, and fundamental misunderstanding of how radar could revolutionize warfare meant that Japan never deployed the technology where it was most needed. They never put effective radar on merchant ships. They never equipped destroyers with sophisticated search radars. They never developed doctrine for using radar in anti-submarine warfare. And most critically, they never imagined that their enemy had solved all these problems and deployed radar in the most unlikely place of all, on submarines. This is the story of 1,200 Japanese ships that vanished into dark Pacific waters, sunk by an enemy that could see them when they couldn't see back. It's the story of technological advantage so complete that the losing side never even understood what weapon was being used against them. It's the story of American submariners who endured brutal conditions, faced terrifying dangers, and achieved strategic victory through a combination of courage, innovation, and technology that their enemy never detected. The men who served in submarines during World War II rarely discussed their experiences after returning home. The missions were classified, the losses were painful. The memories of depth charges, of ships sinking, of weeks submerged in toxic air. These weren't stories that translated easily to peacetime life. Many submariners dealt with what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress, Though the term didn't exist and treatment wasn't available, they had nightmares about drowning, about being trapped in sinking steel tubes, about the faces of men who didn't come back. They carried guilt about surviving when so many didn't. And they carried the knowledge of what they had accomplished, the certain understanding that their efforts had shortened the war and saved lives, even as those efforts required taking lives in ways that haunted them. The Japanese merchant marine officers and crew members, who survived the war, carried their own scars. They had watched ships they served on being sunk. They had lost friends and shipmates. They had survived in lifeboats for days or weeks, watching other survivors die from exposure, dehydration, or injuries. Some had been aboard multiple ships that were torpedoed, experiencing the terror of submarine attack again and again. Their stories, told in Japanese accounts published after the war, describe a growing sense of helplessness, the understanding that no amount of courage or seamanship could protect against an enemy that struck invisibly from the darkness. The technological legacy of submarine radar extends into the present day. Modern submarines, whether American Virginia-class boats, Russian Akula-class boats, Chinese Type 093 boats, or smaller diesel-electric submarines operated by dozens of nations, all carry sophisticated radar systems that trace their lineage to the SJ radar of World War II. The frequencies have changed. The antennas are more sophisticated. The signal processing is done by computers rather than human operators watching cathode ray tubes, but the principle remains unchanged. Detect the enemy before they detect you, and use that information advantage to achieve tactical superiority. Electronic warfare, the science of using, exploiting, and denying electromagnetic spectrum dominance, has become one of the most important fields in modern military technology. Ships, aircraft, and ground forces all carry equipment designed to detect enemy radar, to jam enemy communications, to spoof enemy sensors, and to operate effectively in electromagnetically contested environments. This field, which now represents billions of dollars in annual military spending and employs tens of thousands of specialists, began with lessons learned from submarine radar in the Pacific War. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.